The Galactic Council had been debating for 11 years. 11 years of arguments, of carefully prepared reports, of long speeches delivered in 640 different languages by representatives from every corner of the known galaxy. And yet, no matter how different the words were, the conclusion always came out the same. Humanity had to be stopped. The chamber where the council met was a massive ring station orbiting a quiet blue star near the galaxy's center. It had taken 3,000 years to build and could hold more than 1 million delegates at once. But on the day the final vote was cast, the room felt small, tight, like the walls were pressing in on everyone inside. Ambassador Vale of the Serati stood at the central podium and read the numbers aloud. 412 species had voted in favor. 91 had abstained. Only 3 had voted against the resolution. 3. Out of 506 civilizations that had existed for thousands of years, only 3 dared say no. The resolution was simple. The Sol system would be quarantined and then eliminated. The human race, just 240 years into space travel, had already done things that no species in recorded history had ever managed to do. They had colonized 23 worlds. They had reverse-engineered Serati gravity tech in 4 months, something that had taken the Serati 8 centuries to develop themselves. They had accidentally started and then ended a war between 2 ancient civilizations in the span of a single decade, and somehow made both sides thank them for it afterward. And 3 weeks ago, a human ship had wandered into the Forbidden Zone near the galactic core and come back out again. No one was supposed to go in there. No one who had ever gone in had returned. The humans had gone in, fixed whatever was wrong with their navigation system, eaten what they described as a very stressful lunch, and flown home. That was the moment the council decided enough was enough. The fleet they assembled was not a patrol force or a warning shot. It was the largest military force ever put together in the history of the galaxy. 2,000 warships from 47 different species. The flagship alone was 4 kilometers long and carried weapons that could crack the crust of a planet. There were vessels from the Dreth Armada, cold and angular and bristling with energy cannons. There were the silent ghost ships of the Velkhan, which could become invisible to almost every known sensor system. There were 12 dreadnoughts from the Horgoth Empire, each one so massive that they generated their own gravity fields. Supporting them were hundreds of smaller destroyers, carriers, and support vessels from lesser powers who wanted to be on the winning side when history was written. Admiral Thren of the Dreth was given command. He was old even by Dreth standards, which meant he was almost 4,000 years old, and he had fought in 37 major conflicts across his lifetime. He had never lost a battle. He accepted command with the calm of someone who expected to be home before the season changed. The fleet jumped to the edge of the Sol system on a Tuesday morning, Earth time, though they had no way of knowing that and would not have cared if they did. They dropped out of jump space in a neat formation, weapons systems hot, shields charged, every ship in perfect alignment. Thren looked at the small yellow star ahead of him, the pale blue dot of Earth just barely visible even on the long-range display, and felt something he had not expected to feel. Pity maybe, or perhaps just a faint sadness, the way one might feel watching something end that was, against all odds, genuinely interesting. His communications officer flagged an incoming signal. It was coming from Earth already. The humans had detected them. Of course they had. The fleet had enough mass to distort local space measurably. Thren told his officer to open the channel, half expecting a plea, or screaming, or perhaps an attempt at negotiation that could be politely declined before the bombardment began. What he got instead was a human voice, calm and clear, saying, "This is Admiral Yunhei Ren of the Earth Defense Command. We've been tracking your fleet since you entered the system. We're transmitting a formal notice of territorial violation. Please respond on this frequency." There was a brief pause. "Also, we're counting about 2,000 ships. Is that right? We want to make sure our numbers match." Admiral Thren stared at the speaker. His tactical officer, Commander Seal, looked up from her station with an expression that did not have a name in the Dreth language, but roughly translated to "what is happening." Thren told her to quiet the channel. He needed a moment to think. The humans were not panicking. They were not begging. They were counting ships and filing paperwork. He told himself it did not matter. Numbers were numbers. His fleet could reduce the entire Earth to rubble in hours. He opened the channel again and introduced himself, stated the Council's resolution, and informed Admiral Yun that resistance was not a rational choice. There was a silence on the other end. Then the human admiral said, "Understood. Give us 72 hours to review the resolution. Standard diplomatic protocol." Another pause. "We'll want to show it to our lawyers." Thren closed the channel. He looked out at the star ahead of him. He had fought empires, toppled governments, cracked moons. In 4,000 years, no one had ever asked him to wait 72 hours so their lawyers could look something over. He told his fleet to hold position. There was no reason to rush. The system was surrounded. The humans had no way out, no allies who would dare come, and no fleet that could match even a tenth of his force. 72 hours was nothing. He could wait. What no one on any ship in that fleet knew, and what would have changed everything if they had, was that those 72 hours were not a delay. They were a head start. The first thing Admiral Yunheirin did after closing the channel was call her daughter. Not for any tactical reason. Her daughter was 7 years old and had a school performance that afternoon, and Yun had promised she would try to watch it remotely if she could get a signal. She could. She watched 17 minutes of small children dressed as various historical figures, clapped when her daughter delivered 3 lines as a medieval Korean admiral with impressive conviction, and then ended the call and got to work. The Earth Defense Command headquarters was built into the side of a mountain in Central Asia, deep enough underground that even a sustained orbital bombardment would take a long time to reach it. It had been built 40 years ago, after humanity's first contact with alien life had not gone as peacefully as anyone had hoped. Since then it had been expanded 4 times, and there was currently a heated internal debate about whether a 5th expansion was needed. Yin had always voted yes on that debate. She was a person who believed in preparation. The 72 hours she had asked for were not, as Admiral Thren had assumed, about lawyers. The lawyers were real, and they were genuinely looking at the resolution, but that was not the point. The point was that humanity had known this day might come for a long time. Not specifically this fleet, not specifically this moment, but some version of it. The galaxy was full of powerful, ancient civilizations that were not entirely comfortable with how quickly humans were moving. It had been discussed. Plans had been made. Those plans had been revised and tested and revised again. The 72 hours were the time it would take to activate them. Within the first 6 hours, Earth's 23 colony worlds received priority transmissions. Each colony had standing emergency protocols, and those protocols were now live. Ships that had been sitting in dry dock for years were powered up. On Mars, 300,000 colonists began moving to designated deep shelters that doubled as manufacturing hubs. On Kepler Station, every engineer not currently sleeping was pulled to the fabrication base. The colonies were not panicking either. They had drilled for this. It was not fun, but it was familiar. Meanwhile, 11 human deep space vessels that had been operating near the edge of the Sol system quietly changed course. They were not warships. They were survey vessels, science ships, a couple of long-haul freighters that had been quietly modified over the years in ways that were not reflected in their official registration documents. They did not move toward the alien fleet. They moved away from it, out and around, using the gas giants for cover, heading for the dark spaces between the stars where no one was watching. Their job was not to fight. Their job was to not be where the fighting was. Back in EDC headquarters, Yin was sitting with her senior staff going over the numbers. The alien fleet was enormous. She knew they knew this. 2,000 ships with that kind of firepower could win a direct engagement against anything Earth currently had, and not just barely. It would not even be close. The humans did not have anything like a Horgoth dreadnought. They did not have ghost ship cloaking technology. They did not have Dreth energy cannons. What they had was everything else. They had had 40 years of watching alien military doctrine from as close as they were allowed to get. They had had 40 years of engineers reverse engineering the principles behind technology they encountered in trade and diplomatic exchanges. They had had 40 years of soldiers and tacticians who grew up knowing they were potentially outmatched and spent their careers thinking very hard about what to do about that. And they had certain advantages that were hard to quantify, but that showed up consistently whenever human soldiers trained against alien counterparts in joint exercises. They were unpredictable in ways that were difficult to model. They made decisions that, from the outside, looked like mistakes but turned out not to be. They were stubborn in a way that did not follow any rational survival calculus. And they had a very specific, deeply human habit of finding the one thing their enemy did not expect and doing exactly that. By hour 36, the outer defense network was active. It was not visible. That was the point. The buoys and sensor drones and microplatforms that humanity had seeded through the outer Sol system over the past decade looked like debris, because most of them had been disguised as debris. Space was full of rocks and dust and old dead satellites, and no one bothered scanning all of it. The alien fleet had done a sensor sweep when they arrived and found 2,000 warships, one medium-sized inhabited planet, and a lot of background noise. They had not found the network because they had not been looking for it the right way. By hour 50, Admiral Yun had received confirmation from all 23 colonies. She had received a very long and detailed legal memo from the diplomatic corps about the resolution, which she skimmed because she trusted her lawyers and because there was not much she could do with the information right now anyway. She had eaten 3 meals, slept for 6 hours, and personally reviewed the targeting data on the outer network twice. She was not calm. She was scared, the way that people who are good at their jobs are scared, quietly, usefully, channeled into attention and precision rather than noise. At hour 68, she called her staff together for a final briefing. She stood in front of the display. Why that showed the alien fleet, 2,000 bright points of light hanging at the edge of human space. And she told them what she told every group of soldiers she had ever commanded before a hard mission. She did not tell them it was going to be fine, because she did not know that. She did not tell them they would definitely win, because that was not something she could promise. She told them that every decision they had made in the past 72 hours had been the right one, and that whatever happened next, they had done their jobs. Then she told them to get to their stations. At hour 71, a single human ship launched from Earth's surface. It was small, barely the size of a freighter, and it flew directly toward the alien fleet on a straight-line course that even a cadet could track. It broadcast on all frequencies. Admiral Thren saw it immediately. His officers flagged it as non-threatening, too small, no weapon signatures, moving too slowly to be a ramming attempt. He had the channel opened, curious despite himself about what came next. The message was delivered by a junior diplomat named Rhea Okafor, who looked absurdly young even by human standards, and who introduced herself with a calm smile and said she was there on behalf of the Earth government to deliver a formal response to the Council's resolution. She then handed across a document that was 1,200 pages long, dense with legal citations in 640 languages, which argued on procedural grounds that the resolution was invalid, had been passed in violation of the Council's own charter, and should be suspended pending review by the full body. Thren looked at the document on his display. He did not read it. He told his communication officer to inform the human diplomat that the response was noted, but that the resolution stood and the bombardment would begin in 1 hour. The diplomat nodded, said, "Understood," and her ship turned around and began heading back toward Earth. Thren watched it go. He did not feel pity anymore. He felt something closer to respect. They had done it right, at least. Even at the end, they had done it right. He did not know that the document was not the response. The document was the distraction. The response had been in motion for 68 hours. It was already exactly where it needed to be. Admiral Thren gave the order to advance at exactly the 72-hour mark. Not a minute early, not a minute late. He had told them 1 hour, and he meant 1 hour, and he believed that precision was a form of respect. The fleet moved in formation, the dreadnoughts at the front, the destroyer lines flanking, the ghost ships sliding ahead invisible and silent, reading the space in front of them for threats. The tactical display showed nothing. Deep space, rocks, dust, the faint magnetic whisper of the outer planets. Nothing to be concerned about. The first thing that happened was that 3 of the ghost ships stopped transmitting. They did not explode. They did not raise an alarm. They simply stopped, their signals cutting off cleanly in the space of a single second. The Velcon commander on the lead vessel turned to her crew and asked what had happened. No one knew. There was no debris, no energy discharge, no indication that anything had occurred at all. The ships were just gone. Thren was informed immediately. He ordered the advance to pause and called for a full-spectrum sensor sweep. The sweep came back clean. Whatever had taken the ghost ships had done it without leaving a detectable signature, which was a very specific kind of impossible. Ghost ships were named for a reason. They could detect practically anything. For something to destroy them without being seen, it would have to be either faster than any weapon system in the galactic inventory, or so well hidden that even Velcon sensors couldn't find it. Thren's tactical staff said both of those options were impossible. Thren told them to tell him what was actually happening. Then, and there was a silence in the command room that lasted long enough to become uncomfortable. The answer came from an unexpected direction. A junior sensor analyst on one of the Dreth destroyers, a young officer named Var who had been in service for only 80 years, noticed something in the background noise that did not belong. It was a gravitational variance, tiny enough to be mistaken for natural drift, but repeating in a pattern that natural drift did not follow. She flagged it to her commander, who escalated it, and within 4 minutes Thren had a rough map of what was out there. Not weapons, not ships, a network. Hundreds of nodes distributed through the outer system, woven into the existing debris fields, and all of them connected to each other in a web that was nearly impossible to see from the outside because it had been designed to look like nothing. Thren stared at the map for a long time. He understood what he was looking at. It was a trap, and a very good one. The ghost ships had flown into the edges of it in the dark, and whatever the nodes did, he still didn't know exactly. They had done it quietly enough that no one had heard the ships die. He told his fleet to hold, and had the data sent to every tactical officer across all 2,000 vessels. He wanted everyone thinking. He gave them 20 minutes. In his 4,000 years, he had never needed to give his people 20 minutes to think about a problem. He had never faced a problem that required it. The 20 minutes were almost up when the second thing happened. The Horgoth dreadnought on the left flank reported a proximity warning. Something was very close to it. Not a weapon, not a ship, a human in a suit, alone, outside in space, moving along the hull of the dreadnought with magnetic tools and doing something to the outer sensor array. The Horgoth commander could barely believe what his external cameras were showing him. A single human being, in an environment suit, performing what appeared to be a manual operation on the hull of a 4-kilometer warship in the middle of a battle deployment. The human, apparently aware of the cameras, stopped working, turned toward the nearest lens, and gave what the Horgoth commander's cultural database identified as a human gesture of friendly greeting before going back to work. Security teams were dispatched. By the time they reached the outer hull, the human was gone. Whatever had been done to the sensor array took another 8 minutes to manifest. When it did, the dreadnought's entire targeting system rebooted, and for 40 seconds, every weapon on the vessel was locked and could not fire. 40 seconds was not a long time. In the context of this particular engagement, it would turn out to be long enough. The third thing happened all at once. The network activated. Not everywhere, not the full outer web, which would have been obvious and which the human tacticians had correctly predicted would prompt the fleet to scatter. Just the nodes that formed a loose ring around the rear third of the formation, the support vessels, the carriers, the ships that were carrying fuel and ammunition and repair equipment. The nodes did not fire weapons. They broadcast an electromagnetic pulse, highly focused and specifically tuned, that hit the carrier-class vessel's power relay systems and shut down their jump drives simultaneously. Not destroyed, just shut down. The carriers weren't going anywhere, and neither was anything that depended on them for resupply. Thren absorbed this information. He did not panic. He recalculated. The fleet still had more than enough firepower to complete the mission without the carriers. They would be slower, but they did not need to be fast. He ordered the advance to resume, at reduced speed, and had the damaged vessels form a protected cluster in the center of the formation where the dreadnoughts could shield them. It was the tactically sound decision. His 4,000 years told him it was right. His 4,000 years had never encountered human tactics before. The protected cluster was exactly where the humans wanted the carriers to be. The 11 survey vessels that had slipped away in the first 6 hours of the 72 had spent all of that time moving into position. They were not warships, but they had been modified in very specific ways over the past decade by engineers who had a great deal of imagination and very little respect for the conventional uses of technology. They had no weapons in the traditional sense. What they had were gravity anchors, devices that created a localized, intense gravitational field that lasted for approximately 90 seconds before burning out the generator. The anchors had been developed for mining operations. No one in the Galactic Council had classified them as weapons because they were not, technically, weapons. They were tools. The 11 ships dropped out of the dark from 6 different directions simultaneously and fired their anchors at the center of the Dreth formation, where the dreadnoughts were shielding the carrier cluster. The gravitational fields hit, and the formation buckled. Ships that had been holding precise positions were yanked sideways. Collision warnings screamed on hundreds of bridges. Dreadnoughts that had never needed to perform emergency maneuvers in the whole of their service histories were suddenly doing exactly that. Engines screaming, pilots fighting the unexpected pull while trying not to crash into the vessels next to them. The 11 human ships were already gone by the time the anchor fields faded, sliding back into the dark on trajectories that used the outer planets as cover. Friends people tried to track them. They lost 4 of the 11. 7 got away clean. The formation had not been destroyed. No ships had been lost in the anchor event, though several had taken hull damage from near misses. But the formation was broken, the dreadnoughts were no longer shielding the carriers, and the fleet had spent 11 minutes in defensive emergency maneuvers. And in those 11 minutes, without anyone noticing until it was too late, the human warships had moved. Not from Earth. Not from the direction anyone had been watching. From behind Jupiter. From inside the asteroid belt. From positions that made no sense until you understood that the humans had spent 2 years quietly parking armed vessels in locations that looked like nothing, waited for exactly this moment, and then hit the accelerator all at once. They were still outnumbered. Badly outnumbered. But they were no longer where the enemy expected them to be, and they were moving very fast, and they were heading for the gaps in the formation that the anchor event had created. Admiral Thren looked at his tactical display and understood, for the first time in 4,000 years, that he might have made a mistake. The battle lasted 19 hours. It was not what anyone had expected it to be, which was, in a sense, the whole point. The alien fleet commanders had prepared for a short, decisive engagement against an inferior force. What they got instead was something closer to a storm. Unpredictable, coming from multiple directions, never settling into the kind of clean exchange of fire that their training and doctrine had prepared them for. Thren pulled his fleet into a defensive sphere and tried to stabilize. He was good at stabilizing. He had done it in far worse situations. The sphere held for 4 hours, the dreadnoughts forming the outer shell, their heavy shields taking the pressure of the human assault runs. The human ships did not press the sphere directly. They circled it. They hit it at angles that forced individual ships to turn and expose their flanks to other attackers. They launched waves of drones, cheap and expendable, not to destroy but to force the point defense systems to stay active and drain power. They made noise where there was nothing and went quiet where they were actually moving. It was Commander Seal who figured out what the humans were actually doing 6 hours in. She had been watching the pattern of their attacks, trying to find the logic in it, and had finally identified it. The humans were not trying to win a battle. They were trying to make the alien fleet stay. Every maneuver, every feint, every probe was designed to keep the fleet in the Sol system, in the gravity well, in the middle of the network that the humans had spent years building around their own home. They were not fighting to destroy. They were fighting to hold in place. She brought this to Thren. He listened. He understood immediately. He called for a full retreat. Getting 2,000 warships to reverse course in a coherent way is not a simple thing, even for experienced commanders with well-trained crews. It takes time and space and coordination. The fleet began to turn. The human ships let them turn, which was itself alarming, because it meant the humans knew something that the fleet did not. Thren pushed the pace. He wanted his ships at the jump point and out of the system as fast as possible. He did not know what the humans were waiting for, but he knew they were waiting for something, and he wanted to be gone before it arrived. The jump point was clear when the first ships reached it. Thren ordered them through. 60 ships made the jump, then 90 more. The retreat was working. He was going to get his people out. The jump point stopped working when 400 ships had cleared it. Not an explosion, not an attack. The gravitational geometry just shifted the way it does when a large mass moves into proximity. The remaining 1,500 ships had their jump calculations invalidate in real time. Navigation officers across the fleet scrambled to recalculate. It would take time. Not a lot of time, but some. Seal traced the source of the gravitational interference and found it almost immediately. One of the large asteroids in the outer belt had moved. It had been moving for 8 months, it turned out, on a very slow, very subtle trajectory that no one had noticed because no one had been watching for it. Now it sat directly adjacent to the jump point, its mass enough to distort the local spacetime in exactly the way needed to make jump calculations unreliable. It had not been moved by engines. It had been moved by gravity tractors, slow and patient and almost invisible, over the course of the better part of a year. The humans had moved an asteroid into place to block the retreat. Not today. 8 months ago. They had known this day might come, worked out where the fleet would position itself based on the geometry of the system and the logic of military doctrine, and had spent 8 months quietly moving a rock into a spot that would be useful if they needed it. The fleet was not trapped. Recalculation would take time, not forever, but they were delayed, and delay was now very expensive. Because the network was not finished yet. The outer web had been the first layer. The second layer, the one closer in, had been waiting. The 11 survey ships had burned out their gravity anchors, but they had not been the only ships with unusual modifications. 3 of the warships that had come out from behind Jupiter were carrying something that had no name yet in any galactic language because no one had built it before. The humans called it, informally, a dispersal wedge. It was based on a principle that 2 Caltech physicists had argued about in a published paper 4 years ago, which a military engineer had read on a long flight and found interesting, which a small team had then spent 3 years turning into hardware. It broadcast a signal that interfered specifically with the resonance frequency used by Dreth energy cannons. Not all weapons, just those ones. The cannons fired, but the coherence broke apart before the beam reached effective range. They became noise. The Dreth commanders discovered this at the worst possible moment, when their cannons were most needed. Thren heard the reports coming in and understood. He was a man who had fought for 4,000 years, and he understood immediately, completely, and without self-deception exactly what had happened. He had been read. Not his fleet, not his orders, but his entire approach to war. The doctrine, the assumptions, the things that experienced commanders take for granted because they have always been true. The humans had studied all of it and had spent years quietly building answers to each piece of it, stored away, waiting, patient. He sent the order to cease offensive operations and hold. Not retreat, because they couldn't yet. Not surrender, because that was not what this was. Just hold. Wait for navigation to complete. Get the ships out when the path was clear. Cut the losses and go. 19 hours after the first shots, the last alien ships cleared the jump point. Not 1,500 of them. 712. The rest were disabled, adrift in the Sol system, their crews alive and unharmed. Human ships moved among them delivering supplies and sending communications in a dozen languages asking the crews to confirm they were safe. Rescue teams were offered. Medical support was offered. The communications were polite, the same calm tone that had been there from the very beginning. Not triumphant, not mocking, just practical, matter-of-fact, getting on with what needed to be done. Admiral Yun accepted the formal surrender of Admiral Thren's second-in-command. Thren himself had made it out, in a brief ceremony conducted via comlink. She treated the alien officers with the same professional respect she would have given her own people. There were no speeches about victory. There was a short statement from the Earth government noting that the military action had been conducted in response to an unjust resolution, that no harm had been intended to alien crews, and that the crews of the disabled ships would be returned to their governments as soon as arrangements could be made. The 400 ships that had made the initial jump arrived back at Galactic Council space with a story that took several days to tell in full, because the events kept arriving in pieces and none of them made sense in isolation. When the full picture was finally assembled, the council chamber went very quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when a large group of intelligent beings all have the same thought at the same moment and none of them quite know what to say about it. The humans had fought the largest fleet ever assembled in galactic history, at home, in their own system, using technology no one had known existed, and they had done it while simultaneously maintaining diplomatic contact, filing legal motions, making sure enemy crews were unharmed, and, in at least one documented case, watching a child's school performance. They had not destroyed the fleet. They had taken it apart carefully, kept the crews alive, and sent most of it home with a clear message that could be read by anyone capable of reading the situation honestly. This is what we can do when we need to. We did not want to need to. Ambassador Vale, who had given the speech that finalized the resolution, sat alone in his quarters the night after the reports came in and thought about what he had seen. He had studied human history. He knew they were a young species, barely 2 centuries in space. He had voted for the resolution because the data had said they were dangerous, growing too fast, unpredictable, a threat to the stability of galactic civilization. He still believed all of that was true, but the conclusion he had drawn from it, he now understood, had been wrong. The data hadn't been saying that humanity needed to be stopped. It had been saying something else entirely, something that, in his rush to reach the familiar conclusion, he had completely failed to hear. The thing the data had been saying was that humanity was not a problem to be solved. It was a fact to be dealt with. And the difference between those two things, as several hundred badly damaged warships in the Sol system could now confirm, was enormous. In the years that followed, the Galactic Council did not send another fleet. It sent, instead, a diplomatic delegation. The negotiations lasted a long time and were, by all accounts, complicated and exhausting and occasionally very strange. But they happened. And that, in the long memory of the galaxy, was the thing that mattered most. Not the battle, not the ships that never came back. The conversation that followed, the one that only happened because humanity had made sure there was someone left on the other side to have it.